Okay, so first of all, I would just like you to tell me about your organization and what's the motivation, the motivation for kind of setting up such an organization here in Denmark, and the aims and all other stuffs that the organization are really into. Yeah.
Okay. Well, our organization is called the African Empowerment Center, and we named it the African Empowerment Center because, in our view, people of African descent are underrepresented in terms of human, civil, and social inclusion within the Danish context, within the Danish society, right? Within Denmark. And it's a issue that very little study is done on by the Danish government, uh, and it's actually a problem that the Danish government is not aware of, and people of African descent have found it very difficult to bring these issues to the forefront. So that's why we call it the African Empowerment Center, and that's also our goal to bring it forward. And we know these things to be true because in our study with the community and our contact with the community, these same issues have come up for years. PADs will, in private, will tell you one thing that is very discouraging about their experiences. They will tell you about the racism and the discrimination that they experience within the Danish society, but they find it hard to vocalize it to the Danish society, and they haven't been given a platform to vocalize it within the Danish society. So that's our goal, in essence, to provide a platform for that discussion to occur. And it's the first time in Denmark where that's really been able to happen.
Yeah. And when you say people are underrepresented, what exactly do you mean?
Underrepresented means, well, there's two levels of that. Our issues, how we experience life, the issues that come and how we experience life. When you speak to PADs, their concerns are not being met within the Danish society, within the politics, within the media. They're not being heard. They're essentially being ignored. They're a visible, invisible minority. People see them every day. People talk in the media. Even politicians talk about people of African descent, but they do it from a uneducated point. They do it from a point of actually not including PADs in the dialogue. In other words, they're guessing. They believe that there is no racial discrimination in Denmark, for one. Most political parties take on that platform, that there's structural discrimination, there's discrimination of all indvandrere, but there is no specific discrimination against people of African descent or black people. Right? That has never been addressed. So in the work market, you can find people of African descent that are actually being discriminated against, passed up for jobs because of their color. There's a kind of colonial perspective in Denmark which says black people are lucky. They should be happy to only have cleaning jobs, to have low-level positions in companies. They're the hard workers. You can rely on them for hard work, but you cannot rely on them for their intellectual capacity. You cannot rely on them for their education, the educational value or experience or credentials.
Yeah, when you say it's still on the representation issue, when you say minorities, people of African descent, these are minorities who are underrepresented. Is it in reference to the fact that you feel and when I say you, I don't mean you as a person, I mean the organization, because now you are speaking for the organization. You feel that there are other minorities who are given more privileges or who are being represented more or given more opportunities than people of African descent?
Well, I think what it means is that Well, that we're just talking about one level right now, right? There's another aspect to it, but what it means is that number one, in the context of a democracy, right, like Denmark, PADs have a little voice politically, so the negative situations they find themselves in, and the criticisms and the issues that they face every day are not actually making it out to the political debate. They're not making it out to on a governmental level. So the government is taking no account for it. So in that way, they're underrepresented. Because obviously, in a democracy, to be heard, it primarily relies on voting participation, right? So PADs, they're not the biggest minority in Denmark. Even though they're a substantial one, they're not the biggest. You could say how the Danish government looks at the minorities or the Inwander or the people with other background. They put them into groups of first foreigner, then Muslim. That's a known group, Muslims, right? And Middle Eastern people. That's kind of how they look at it, because they're very well seen in the society, not just walking down the street, but through owning businesses, through their political activism. They're involved, politically. They're represented within most political parties. You see them being discussed in the media, those kind of things. But PADs, their issues, and even their issues are not really being represented in terms of discrimination, and they're also not being included in the discussion about discrimination. They're not being included in the discussion about how the schools should be structured, what could be done better in the schools to include even minorities. So you could, an example of that would be Danish schools have adopted this thing about now we don't serve pork in these schools because there's Muslim kids, right? But if you go to the Danish textbooks, they're still saying the N-word. They're still showing colonial images of Africans. If a child says, "I don't want to be called the N-word" in a school environment, that the teacher is actually going to go against that child's right, because the teacher is also misinformed about this person's rights. A person has the right to say, "I don't want to be called that." But in the Danish society, they say that no, this word is perfectly fine. So again, that child is actually being marginalized. No matter how hard that term or those images hurt that child, their feelings are being ignored, and there's no one coming to address them and make sure that their experiences is put at the table as a real issue equally with others. So it's not a thing about saying that I don't like to say, our organization doesn't take the position of trying to say that other minorities are more special. Of course, there's many minorities in Denmark. It's not just Muslims, it's not just Middle Easterns. There's also white Americans. There's Americans who are also here that have privilege, that can come to Denmark without speaking Danish, and they get into companies, they get into government contracts, things like that, without even speaking the Danish language. You see? So there's a broad list of minorities, so some are actually more privileged than others, but we don't like to point out necessarily which ones. We like to just say that ours are not being heard, and this is what we would like to be done about that. Just like other minorities have that opportunity, and many of them are pretty successful in that.
Okay. Yeah, and that's quite interesting. And can I say then that the organization, the AEC, is more kind of politically focused, because it seems to me that the issues that are being addressed are more in terms of political kind of issues that needs to be addressed. So the organization is more politically focused in terms of talking about issues more politically for PADs. Is that right?
Well, I think No. Well, what we do is we take things from a human rights standard. That's our base. And within the scope of human rights, all of these things play a role. And when you have human rights, right, the government is supposed to make sure that those human rights are translated through civil rights, right? And of course, the politicians play a role in that. The whole society plays a role in that, as in a democracy like Denmark, right? But the problem is, again, when you're not represented substantially within those arms of government, within that democracy as a voter or as a politician, often you find it difficult to get those things heard. So we're not a political organization, but we're aware that politics is one aspect of life, one responsibility of all people that live in Denmark. That's a civil right to vote. It's when you become a citizen now, you're allowed to vote even for the parliamentary elections. So the mere fact that you live here as a resident, you're allowed to vote already. That's one of your civil rights. That's based on human rights, right? So, yeah, we do focus on political activity because we know that that is a aspect to it, one aspect to it, but that's not our platform. You know, we just find the politics in Denmark is troubling in actually implementing and people's human rights, all people's human rights, and we also find it troubling that they seem to not be concerned about smaller groups like PADs. The discussion never seems to be put on the table. A good example of that is like right now in the UN, the UN has called this the decade for people of African descent. But have you heard politicians or communes in Denmark using that theme at all? Taking that theme into context in any civil manner, in the education, in the communes, in the politics? I haven't, even though it's outlined by the UN. So that in itself is a perfect example of how we're a visible but invisible minority. You know, just here in Denmark, all countries don't take that stance, however, you know?
Yeah. And, during my research on the organization, I came across something which was quite really interesting to me, and that was your organization, the symbol. I mean, that has to do with your logo as well. I mean, I'm quite familiar with what the symbol is and its meaning because I think it's kind of a Ghanaian thing. Yeah, so I don't know, but maybe that's what I was thinking. So I just wanted to know.
Broader than Ghana.
Yeah, yeah. So I wanted to know what's why that symbol and what's the, because for me that symbol, the meaning in the Ghanaian context, I don't know in other contexts, but for me in the Ghanaian context means it's the local word used is Jinyami, which means accept God. And that's the meaning in the Ghana. So I wanted to know if it has any relation with the organization. What's its relation with why that symbol in specific?
Well, Denmark is you'll hear people often say and refer to Denmark as a Christian country. And also within the dialogue in Denmark, a big dispute seems to be about the religion of Islam also, right? But, again, we picked this symbol, right, because this is a reflection of a large group of African people, a writing system, number one, and also a faith. However, where you could say our usage of that symbol is somewhat of a hybrid meaning, so it's a step further than what Westerners view as God, right? Or Denmark might view as God, because obviously they might interpret God as something different than a Muslim or any person for that matter, right? So how we apply that is we say that this concept is also a personal responsibility, right? It's a societal responsibility, right? And that means taking responsibility. So you yourself as an individual need to understand that you are the responsible party in achieving what you will, achieving what good you want to make, and creating what bad you want to create, right? You have to accept the responsibility, right? And so that's one of the reasons, that's even the main reason why we picked that term, because we feel like if you believe in something, you will walk with that in your practice, you know? So we try to exhibit that within our organization. But you could say a Western term with it would be responsibility, you know? Responsibility for everything, you know? Taking a role in this. So that means in the Danish context, if you feel oppressed, you have a responsibility to speak about it, right? And you have that authority already yourself. That authority is omnipotent. You know, it exists no matter what government you live under, what type of government you live in. It's a human right. You know, it's even before human rights were even created.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah. That's it. And then my next question now, I think I'm a bit with the organization. The other question I wanted to know is the organization has its aim of creating a community for people of African descent. And who are this community? I mean, what are the target people in this community? And yeah.
right. Well, people of African descent, defined by the UN Working Group, are people, migrants from Africa, people also that have been displaced because of colonialism and slavery, and people who identify as African, people of African descent, right? And so that's the view we take of who these people are, right? But we find the issue in Denmark is that the focus in how this is being discussed is problematic, and that it actually stops a community from being created. For an example, since we are a minority, right, in this country, and because we have very different backgrounds, even within that broad group and that dynamic background, you know, we find that how it's being discussed it actually hinders it. Like, for example, you're Ghanaian. In the Danish context, that's what that means. Boom, you're Ghanaian. That's it. We have 4,000 Ghanaians here. 4,000 Ghanaians are left to mobilize on all the issues and all the affairs themselves. So if the commune wants to fund a project, it's based on those numbers, right? But you will find the same small numbers and even smaller numbers existing of PADs, like African Americans. They're even smaller number than Ghanaians here in Denmark. So if we have an association, the government is only responsible for funding us by how many members we have, right? So you will find that there's a lot of Ghanaian associations, there's a lot of multiple Eritrean associations, Somali associations, but because we're all basically identified as separate people, we're actually having difficulty creating cultural centers. You know, and in Denmark, cultural centers are a very big part of the welfare in the society, how they do things in the society. Cultural money is huge, right? But only those that are able to mobilize get real access to it. And you can see that in the cultural centers all around, where we have our events. They're all cultural centers. But how many PADs do you see working in the cultural centers? How many of the cultural centers do you see that have special focus for people of African descent? But you will find in the larger minority groups, like Muslim minority groups, they're able to mobilize because their numbers are much bigger, so they can have a center that works specifically in that context. Whereas though the broad amount of PADs never get that opportunity.
Yeah. So in your definition of the people of African descent, so the community of people of African descent, I realized there were like three different communities.
You're behind that,
Og du har stadig din med.
That's fine.
Yeah, the fact is, you're buying cup kaffe.
En kop kaffe?
No, yellow. Stop.
Yeah, there were three different groups of people who, to me, from what you mentioned, forms this community of people of African descent. I don't know if I'm right in that sense, because I noticed you mentioned displaced people, and then you mentioned people with colonial something.
People that have been displaced because of colonization and
enslavement. That's one group.
Right.
And then you have
people, immigrants that migrate directly on their own free will, and their descendants, right?
Yeah.
And their descendants can also, there's another term that we use for that, Black Europeans.
Yeah.
People that have been living in Europe that consider themselves black, consider themselves PADs, but it might be a black German. It might be a person that family may have been in Europe for over 100 years. You know, what they know is this experience, right?
So basically, these are kind of two major groups who are into this community as well.
It's three major,
and the third one, if I don't. You talked about the migrants, and you talked about
the free
colonial
migrants.
Displaced people,
Right.
and then
Slavery.
it's colonial displaced and slavery people. They are one group.
Right. And
then
then there's the people who have migrated for other reasons, that free of their will, but have been in Europe for long periods of time, and that consider themselves just black Europeans.
Okay. So in all these three groups, what I want to know is, if I want to play the devil's advocate here, why should these people identify with the same, same theme, same idea? Why should? Because they have separate, different experiences. They have separate, different needs, and some of them may not identify with what the organization feel all of us should come together to identify with. So why should they? For instance, I will use myself as an example. For instance, I can feel I'm part of the migrant people. Migrants who are part here. Why should I identify with those who have colonial displaced people? Because they have different experience. I also have different experience. I have different needs. They have different needs. But why should we all come together? There is this idea that, and a lot of people have talked about it, that people usually go out to talk about people with certain descent should all come together because they feel they are from a certain descent. But there is also the reason why we have different experiences. So why should we come together in terms of, why do you feel people should come together as a community, to share the same belief and share the same idea as an African community with different experiences, individual experiences?
Because actually, we've noticed, and this is something that goes on across Europe, right? With all of these groups, right? The issues that they face are actually pretty much undermined, So, for an example, a black European could be a person from France, right? And they've been living in France the whole time. They speak French, they identify as French, but when it comes to racism, which is the perception of race, a white French person will not see them as will not ever see them as just French. So they will see them as part of the old political, colonial history, meaning that they don't come from here. When in fact there's a lot of people that really just exist as French, and they contribute to the French society every day, but because of that discrimination, they're not able to have a voice on it. They're not able to be included. A good example of that is one of the first prime minister, woman of African descent, black woman, soon as she was elected, it was a big shock to where she had to be called a monkey. For some reason. So why is she called a monkey? Why is she viewed as a monkey? Why would someone say that? You see? So the discrimination that these people face because of their descent, right? Not that they all have the exact same experiences, but because of their descent, they're viewed as different in the overall society. And in Denmark, that's equally true. It's equally true, and that's primarily the reasoning behind it. It's to make sure that we as a people are not told we don't belong here. That it's to make sure that we as a people, if we're coming, if we share this descent, that we're not constantly pointed out as a slave. That we're not constantly pointed out as a person who contributed nothing to society. That we're not constantly pointed out as being lucky to just live here, and therefore you should really not have any say politically. You should not voice your opinions. Your view should not be accepted or has no place in the overall society. It's to fight against discrimination, structural discrimination, and that's a structural discrimination, but also other forms of discrimination. But those things we found that all these different groups always have issues with. That's the thing that all these three groups discuss. That's the thing that all these three groups, and when you listen to them, they all have this in common. Another example could be a biracial person, quote unquote biracial person, right? A person could be born here in Denmark, never know any other country, identify as Dane, but the moment they go out into society, someone calls them black. Someone calls them mulat, which is a derogatory term that means half black, right? And they're using this to say that you don't actually come from here, you don't belong here. And right now in the political dynamic, when politics becomes very disheartening, nationalist parties have been winning all across Europe. And what their theme is to define who belongs here and who does not. And it's according to their views. And their views, how they construct them, give people that are white an advantage over people that are not. Their view of it is white people are at the top of this society, and the darker you are, the lesser place you have in the society.
So it's the empowerment, creating a community of empowerment, mainly against discrimination or racial discrimination. Is it the main thing?
Yeah,
the main focus.
Right, because that discrimination affects everything else. It affects how we access the society. It affects your experience when you try to go to school and apply for education. As people hear when we do these panels, people bring it up all the time. It affects how they get housing. It affects how their experience is with the police department, right? It affects them in many different ways. Whereas though a white person, it's not affected by it. A good example of that you can see is when the trains, many people have been migrating here, asylum seekers, right, recently because of different conflicts around the world, right? But a black person who's on that train from Germany is unilaterally, if they're sitting in a train with other black people, even if they don't know them, all those black people will be identified and ask for ID, and white people will not. Same white people on the train, they're not viewed as fleeing war or conflict. Even though the reality is that a white person could be coming from Syria. Syrians have white people there too. Africans have white people in it.
So and then what's kind of empowerment are they getting? Is the community getting? What kind of empowerment?
Well, right now, we're a new organization, right? So we have many goals and many initiatives that we want to put into effect. But because we're new, we have to start off with the most crucial ones that intersect with all the other issues. So discussing the discrimination and discussing how it affects PADs, allowing PADs to vocalize this themselves, it is the first step. You know, it's only the first step. Then, once we create a understanding with the broader community that it's not just one person saying this, that it's not just 2 or 3 people saying this, that it's people, black people, people of African descent from many different backgrounds that are experiencing the same specific type of discrimination, right? Then we can move towards the next stage. And that is saying, okay, what are the solutions? Now that the broader public sees and understands from black people what their view are, from people of African descent what their views are, how they experience things, only then can the society mobilize to address it.
Yeah. So the organization has been around for how long?
2 years.
2 years. Okay, that's pretty a short time.
Yeah, it's a pretty short time.
And what has been some of the success and challenges?
The challenges, sources?
Yeah, sources and challenges. I mean,
By sources, what do you mean?
I mean, success. How successful has the organization?
Successes.
Yeah, successes
Challenges,
and
right.
challenges. Yeah.
The successes, I would say, have been that for the first time, the discussion has been taken into national media, into the national context, by PADs, by people that have experienced it. Whereas though before that had not really been done on a national level. Another success is that we've been able to show PADs who often are fearful of discussing this issue because of rejection. They feel they will be rejected. They feel that they will be punished for talking about these issues even though they're very real. We've been able to show them that that is not necessarily the case, right? And we've also been able to explain to them why it's not necessarily the case. We've been able to show them that there are tools that that one can utilize to make sure that even though they are discussing these things, that people can be punished for trying to stop them. You know, that it's your human right to actually discuss it. So we've been able to really get human rights information and the application of these human rights out to PADs because it hadn't been done before in Denmark. A good example of that is, like I said, the decade of people of African descent. That's very rarely talked about in Denmark. Afrophobia, anti-black racism, never really discussed in the political platform. It even gets deeper. The CERD documents regarding anti-discrimination from the UN working groups, they're not even disseminated to the Danish public broadly. And we're the only organization that's really active in making sure that PADs have at least access to that information if they want to. You see? Also, the UN directives, regarding that. So those have been the successes. The challenges or some of the problems that we face in doing that have been things that, like Frantz Fanon has described, a lot of our people, because we have experienced colonization, because we've experienced slavery, because we've experienced displacement, because we've experienced racism and discrimination because of our color, a lot of us have had to live with that inside of us before and have never been given a tool to discuss it, to analyze it within ourselves, to analyze internal racism that we've internalized about each other, due to false education in Western media, due to lack of education broadly on the issues of colonization, slavery, and discrimination, anti-black racism, right? Due to that, we often come at odds with ourselves in doing so. For example, a good example of that could be when we talk about the term the N-word, right? And how it's used in Denmark openly in the parliament, how it's used openly in the school curriculum, how it's used openly in the society. There are some people that are born here that have been told by Denmark that just means black. And that's all that they're told. And so they grow up being called that. And then when they see others that are just coming really from similar backgrounds, other black people, other PADs that have a different experience with that word, say that they do not want to be called that, say that that word is racist, say that that word means I'm a slave, say that that word connects with colonial history and oppression of black people. The people who have been taught that it just means black, they come into a conflict then because it's never been discussed with them. You see, so there's psychological damages that actually come into play. There's colonial boundary issues that come into play, like for example, the context of a Ghanaian, just being a Ghanaian. A Ghanaian is not a Hausa, right? Even though Hausa exists in Ghana, exists in Nigeria, exists in Cameroon, right? They're being told, the focus is being put on you're a Ghanaian, and so therefore we just work with Ghanaians because we're different. Ghanaians are just a different people, right? The concept of working across these boundaries, colonial boundaries that have been put into place by colonial powers, right? It becomes a challenge there because even though we may be, even though we're not just Ghanaians per se, as an example, even though you could be Hausa, why should you not work with another Hausa? Why should you not know that Hausas were also put into slavery too? And that there's many people of Hausa descent that you could also work with if you acknowledge that history, right? So those colonial boundaries actually stop us from working together. I mean, that's come up all the time, you know, because in Denmark, funding is done by nationality, you know, when it comes to PADs. So when people get together and say, oh, this is the last thing. When people get together and say all of a sudden, yeah, wait a second, I'm Ghanaian, but I'm also Hausa. Wait a second, I'm Ghanaian, but I'm also black. Wait a second, I'm Ghanaian, but my history also connects with the diaspora in America, for example. Why can't we work with them? Why can't we work together and pool resources together, right? As soon as they decide to do that, because of those history markers, so as soon as they decide to do that, they're being called racist. So that's also a challenge, and that's a very real problem because people will call them that, even though it's outlined differently in the UN.
Yeah. And some of your works you've been doing, which I've also been following up and attending, include the Women of Panel discussion. That are some of your works and platforms you are creating for empowering people of African descent. And I remember we also talked about, you know, some of your works which include going to some of these asylum-seeking homes and refugee houses to educate these migrants who are people of African descent. So that also includes some of your works, right? Mm-hmm. And so I realized that there were kind of two different groups that you work with. More of people who are like a bit within the same African community, people are like a bit kind of disadvantaged or marginalized, which are the immigrants who are looking for asylum and other stuffs, and who are sometimes, you know, which sometimes also I think includes some of these people who stays in asylum houses and that. And then also I've seen the Women of Color discussion panel, which includes more of people I see as a bit of in a different position, kind of a bit of a kind of a so not disadvantage, an advantage position, because they have been around in Denmark, they've had their education and all everything. So I think they are a bit of advantage in terms. So with these two groups, do you have separate programs for them, or do you have programs that brings them all together to share their experiences?
Yeah. Well, what we do is with asylum seekers specifically. What we do is we partner up with other organizations, primarily, specifically one organization called Freedom of Movements. And the reason why we partner up with Freedom of Movements or even other organizations is because, as a rule of thumb, with human rights issues, right, you're not to assume the role of being the mouthpiece for the affected group, right? And we realize that that's one thing. The other thing is that the people that are that do need to work with these groups are people that have specialized tools and understanding about it. So that's why we partner up with, you could say, Freedom of Movements, for example, because they have those special informations, those special tools, and on top of that, a special understanding that these asylum seekers have to be empowered to vocalize their differences themselves. So they don't need us telling them what they should say or telling the Danish population what their experiences are, but we need to empower them so that they can tell their experiences, because we do know that their experiences are being undermined. They're often being talked about, but no one's actually ever hearing them tell their stories, right? And the last reason why we work with Freedom of Movements is, it's touching on the same point again of not speaking for these groups, but helping empowering them, right, so that they can speak and get their stories out there. Is that Freedom of Movements, they understand the role of our organization. They understand similar values, and those values are that colonization has affected these groups from moving forward and advancing, like in comparison to what Denmark has done. You know, they have been colonized versus Denmark has not. You know, Denmark's not suffering from colonization right now. You know, some of these groups are affected by, you know, their history of slavery. They've been the victims of that, whereas Denmark has not been the victim of slavery, but they affected them. So they understand some of the core values of AEC, and another example of that value is that PADs need to be speaking for themselves and taking the responsibility themselves, and then others can support them to get their message out, not be the voice for PADs. That PADs have to be their own voice. That is critical in this human rights struggle, that the affected group are empowered to mobilize themselves and get their views out in the front, rather than being told by others what they should do, what they should think, things like that.
And what about the Women of Color panel or the Women of Color platform? Because I see the Women of Color platform as people who are more of the elite society in Denmark. Even though they are black descent, they have good education, they have almost everything to their advantage. So I see those people who come on those platforms as kind of the elite African descent society or community. Is that the same thing you see?
We don't see it like that, because one of the things that we try to encourage, again, through human rights, having a strong understanding of human rights, is that people often think things based on what their own personal experience has been, but not going out finding out what the broader experience has been, right? And that our job is to go out and find out what the broader experience has been. I can always speak for myself, but I can't speak for another person's experience, right? So I would say there's a problem with this dynamic of coining people as elite when you're talking about PhDs, because no one has gone out to do surveys on PhDs. I mean, in fact, we're the only organization that specifically outlined that and has done that for the first time, to actually go out and take a broad group of PhDs and say, ask them questions to find out who the elite is. Like myself, for example, I don't have a PhD. I have friends who have PhDs too, but I also have friends who are asylum seekers. I also have friends who are handwerker. I also have friends who, clean for a living. I mean, how does that make me an elite? And I'm the vice chairman of the organization, right? Another example of that could be, on the surface, someone could assume that these are elite people.
Just making sure that it's recording. Yeah, it's working.
Yeah, you could assume that, but actually, when you talk to these people, you will find out that a lot of these people are just students. In Denmark, how could being a student be a representation of an elite person when everybody in Denmark have the right to go to school and be paid for it? Who is the elite? I mean, how do you qualify what that term means, elite? You know, does elite mean you're in a political party that
I mean, the reason why I asked and maybe give that kind of classification was due to the fact that I was thinking or just looking at the two groups of people you were working with. One of more of a kind of have a general understanding and kind of an education, you know, have a big kind of a platform to express him or herself, and the other group who are the migrants who are kind of the refugees don't have that, you know, that's the comparison that so they don't have that platform to express themselves and, you know, to say what they want to say. So it looks like one is at an advantage side and then the other one is, so that's why I wanted to just get a clarification of
we don't view
okay
any PhDs in Denmark as being elite in anything. Right? Not any group. Not asylum seekers, in our view, are not elite. Residents and citizens, in our view, are not elite. In our view, they all have strengths and they all have weaknesses. You know? And in our view, they all have common issues. And the common issue is that they haven't been given a platform. This is the first time. A lot of the women in the Women of Panel discussions, and even many of the audience members, you can hear them say time and time again, thank you, because this is the first time we've had an opportunity to speak our minds, to speak on these issues specifically. So I don't think any of them are elite. I think they're all in a serious, problematic situation.
But do you have the same program for all of them? Because I think they have both of them have, maybe they have the same issue, but they have different experiences. So do you bring these different experiences together to talk about the same issues?
We don't. Well, we bring them together in the sense that, well, first of all, there's an issue of locality. Like our location, our organization's location, and where we exist, our members primarily is in Copenhagen, right? And so we're not operating in other parts of Denmark, and that goes beyond residents, citizens, and asylum seekers. You see, so their ability to be able to hear the discussions and play a part in the activities is primarily has those challenges, locality involved in it. We try to, as a basic principle, try to give everybody an equal platform, you know? And we consider, even in our organization, everybody's perspective equal, you know? We don't have any other way to go about it, because logically, we know that we're dealing with a group of people where a lot of studies are not being done. But at the same time, it's obvious that there are people that have advantages over others. But that is not something that we think becomes a problem in who we pick to be on a panel, for example. That's not something that we think to be a problem in terms of who can hear the discussion necessarily. We think that those problems only exist in the minds of those people who believe they're elite or believe that they're privileged over others, you know? Us as an organization, we don't see the privilege. We see that the problem is some people see themselves as more privileged, and we just say, if you feel you're more privileged, then hey, that means you can actually do something to help these affected groups. You know, that's all we do. And then we also say to the asylum person, for example, or asylum seeker, we explain to them that although you're in this situation, you should understand that your voice is still a powerful tool in this situation. That you organizing as asylum seekers is still a powerful tool in your situation, and a lot can be done. And if you do that, then we can come and support you. You see, so that's how we view it. I don't know if that makes any sense. It's, you know.
And then
there are issues of privilege that come into play, but it's not an issue of our organization. It's an issue that we see is just in the diaspora. There are people. There's always an issue in every community where there's people who believe they're doing better than others. And of course, there's also issues of nationality. Like I could say, in my example, since I'm African American, right, I might be identified as black and therefore stopped. But when the judicial system sees my passport or finds out I'm American, they may conduct themselves differently than as if someone who doesn't have an American passport.
Precisely what I wanted to come up to, because for you as the vice president and your president, you are in a different kind of privileged position or status. So does that influence in the way you do your work in helping the other who are like underprivileged or who don't have that right to express themselves in that sense?
I think it does. You know, I would say it does in the sense that, for example, I'm the vice president. Joseph, he's half Danish, half Tanzanian, right? People won't see that he's Danish. People will see that he's Tanzanian, right? Or they will see that he's African descent, right? But when they find out that he's Danish, one Danish person may say, oh, okay, well, he speaks Danish and he's part Danish, so maybe I should listen to him, you know, because I know that he might at least know what the Danish culture is. Culture always comes up in these dialogues, and he can express himself in not only the language, but in a way to where Dane, who might not want to listen to anybody at all, when they hear his voice, they might take one more second to listen, you know? Because obviously there's a lot of Danes that, even though they may be racist, they may do racist things, they may feed into the system of structural racism, they may not consider themselves racist. So when they hear someone like Joseph speak, they may say, wait a second, he speaks just like my father spoke. Or, you know, so in that way there is some things of privilege, you know?
Yeah, the same maybe applies to you as well as an African American. Yeah.
But there's also disadvantages because when you compare it to the white Dane, because the white Dane doesn't have any problem getting their voice out. So we're still disadvantaged, you know? An example of that could be, as soon as they find out I'm American, then everything I say, they start trying to translate to an American view. And they try to devalue the fact that I've been here and I've been speaking with the community to listen to the community and hear what the concerns are of the community. They will easily push that aside as, no, it's just American. That's how you do things in America. We don't want that here. Whereas though they can't say that to Yosef. You know, I mean, our organization it has many different members from many different backgrounds, and the only thing the thing that brings us together is the fact that even though we have these many different backgrounds, we're still experiencing anti-black racism, Afrophobia, structural discrimination. No matter if you're born here or not, no matter if your father or your mother is Danish or not, no matter, one of the things that I could say as an individual about privilege, even though I'm American, that's not my main privilege. That's not my main resource. That's not the thing that I believe allows me to be involved in human activism, in social activism. I would say my main privilege is that I come from a strong family myself that has instilled values in me, that has given me access to a quality education, not just the education I get from school, but also in my home has helped shape my view as a black person, as a person of African descent. Even though I'm American, my family was understood that as a person, as a human, I was going to be affected by racism in the broader society already, and so therefore they needed to give me access to tools so I could exist, so that I could carry on, even though I'm black, even though I might have a certain history, even though I might be presented with challenges because of my descent, so that include access to books about African history, so that I could see, that hey, we have the same issues, and so I could also not be Afrophobic myself. So I wouldn't see another black person from another country as what the white narrative always is, and even in my own country. And you could see in Denmark is very similar. The educational system is very similar to the U.S. It doesn't give PADs a positive view of PAD history. It simply refers to them as colonial objects of slavery or people who have not contributed anything to society, which is really a lie. People of African descent, and every person of African descent, and every person in the world, for that matter, should know that civilization was essentially built in Africa. The major tools of civilization were essentially built in Africa before they went anywhere else. And African people played a major role themselves in their own initiatives to bring that civilization to other parts of the world. So other societies have benefited from our contributions, So that means that even though I've experienced colonization or slavery or things like that, it means that I can go back in history and see that, wait a second, we actually invented paper. We invented the first writing systems. We had a network that was so vast. We actually had the first empires around the world. We benefited from civilization before others had benefited from what is called civilization. So in knowing that, I can know that I am not just a slave. I am not just a subject of someone else. I am not just to be told what to think. I'm also a person that can shape others' views of how things should be. I'm also a person that can provide solutions. I can be a doctor and actually say, you have this sickness, I'm going to fix your sickness. This is how you fix your sickness. I can have a role in the world. Yeah.
So 2 years and still counting. What's the way forward for AEC?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah.
Well, we're still working. We have an agenda. We have an agenda that has different initiatives involved, and some of the initiatives are cultural initiatives. Some of the initiatives are human rights initiatives, right? And so some of them are educational initiatives also, right? So, but at the same time, you know, we have those. The good thing is we have those areas outlined, and we have initiatives already drawn up that we want to put into place. For right now, the issue is resources, human resources, and economy. You know, to be able to put those initiatives into effect. So it is difficult because we don't get money from the commune. All of our finances are based on our members, and contributions from the community, which are small. Very, 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 very small. In fact, members pay far more than the contributions from the community. You see, so you know, even though we have some good initiatives written up, and we've outlined these areas, we're only going to be able to put into place the ones that we can actually have the resources to put into place at the time. But I think you could say primarily it's going to focus right now. The top of the agenda is making sure that PADs get their voice out. That's a primary underlying thing that we have to accomplish, because that affects everything else. You know, when PADs talk about their experience in school, we need that to be known to the broader public. When they talk about their lack of representation in politics, that's an issue, because whenever the elections come around, politicians like to associate themselves with this sometimes, but they don't like to speak about it once they get elected. You know, after the election, then, you know, and so speaking about the issues is key, because if we don't speak about them and we don't mobilize the community and give them a platform to speak about these issues, the politicians simply don't have to do anything about it. The commune doesn't have to the local communes don't have to do anything about it. We will be a visible, invisible minority. So our main goal right now is to make sure that we're a visible minority.
Yeah, thank you, Victor. Thank you so much. I appreciate this interview, and it's been quite insightful for me as well. And I think I will sit and listen again, and if there's more questions to be asked, I will just contact you and let you know.
Yeah, thank you, brother. It's a pleasure.
Victor.
Thank
It's
you
a
very
pleasure
much for having me and doing the interview. It means a lot to our organization.
Thank you so much.